Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
He bestrides the Northern Ireland peace process and indeed the Troubles like a colossus of controversy. Martin McGuinness has passed away after an illness linked to his heart, a very rare heart condition, and this furiously binary zeitgeist that we inhabit at the moment, where you have to pick a side and then stick to it absolutely slavishly, regardless of whether or not things change, facts change, or reality changes, doesn't really lend itself to a nuanced analysis of his career, does it? So let's start with some things we can all agree on. He was a terrorist. He condoned and quite possibly committed murder of soldiers and civilians. He was also, and this might not be something everyone can agree on, he was also absolutely crucial to the cessation of hostilities. There'd be no peace process without him. I think that last bit's true, right? I don't think the peace process could have kicked in unless people who actually had a foot in the terrorist camp of the IRA were involved. That gave him agency. It gave him validity in the eyes of people who didn't want to lay down their arms, because he had been not just with them, he had led them. So when the time came to put the guns down, to leave the bombs behind and try to move towards peace in Northern Ireland, that process could never have been led by someone who had always been peaceful, could it? If you're going to lead former, and they see themselves as soldiers, I'm not going to get bogged down in the semantics today. I'll continue to call them terrorists. We'll probably save for another occasion that age-old question of what the difference is between a terrorist and a freedom fighter. I want to look more specifically perhaps today at Martin McGuinness. But these former terrorists were not going to abandon terror at the behest of somebody who had never endorsed it, I don't think. So, murderous scum on the one hand, but he changed. He came to recognise that the path towards peace was going to be more easily and more quickly negotiated if they stopped killing people. If actually, we've got to be clear about this, if they stopped killing each other. It's a fascinating and very complicated question that oddly doesn't necessarily lend itself to, well, I mean, you've seen what the coverage has been like today. You've got Norman Tebbit on the one hand saying that, you know, I'm glad he's dead. A little bit, perhaps, ignorant of or unconcerned about the feelings of his grandchildren, his children. I don't say this very often, I genuinely hope they weren't listening to the radio or watching the telly this morning when they saw Norman Tebbit come on and celebrate the death of their granddad and dad. But Norman Tebbit's wife was horribly injured in the IRA bomb at that hotel in Brighton, so you can understand his feelings. More impressive to me is Jo Berry, who lost her father in that attack and has said this morning that she recognised Martin McGuinness as a man who moved from terror to peace, who changed, who understood, if you like, not the error of his ways, because he never apologised or condemned what he had done previously, what he had endorsed previously, but perhaps the redundancy of his old ways. The terrorism, I hesitate to use a word like achieve, but terrorism took the Republican movement in Northern Ireland so far, and Martin McGuinness was one of the first to recognise that it couldn't take it any further. And oddly, because he has blood on his hands, oddly, he was therefore responsible for a lot of deaths not happening. The cessation of hostilities, the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, all contributed to life continuing for people who otherwise would have lived under the yoke of terrorism, under the yoke of reaction to terrorism, and then, of course, there would have been more death. 7 minutes after 10 is the time. I need a pithy question, but it doesn't really lend itself to pithy questions, does it? This story, this life, this career. The question I would ask you is whether or not you recognise that people can change. You can, by all means, tweet yourself furiously about what a murderous scumbag he is. No one's going to dispute the fact that he was a terrorist. He was a commander in the IRA. It's a matter of a historical fact. It was never denied. But anybody with even a cursory understanding of Irish history, recent Irish history, 20th century Irish history, will also acknowledge, as indeed everybody from the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland right through to the daughter of a terrorist victim recognises, it couldn't have been done without him. So riddle me this. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. It's trying to avoid this. Get my words correct on this one. It's very important before I ask you to contribute that I make sense myself, isn't it? But this idea that no one ever shifts, no one ever moves, no one ever changes is kind of the definition of bigotry, isn't it? That's what a bigot is. A bigot is somebody who cannot change despite enormous amounts of evidence telling them that they should or must or did. You have a kind of sense maybe that because you can't ever change your mind about anything, it's impossible to believe that other people can. It's not dissimilar, oddly, on a much lighter level, to the conversation about bias with regard to reporting. Some people, the editor of the Daily Mail believes it is impossible for somebody to be objective, ever, because it's impossible for him. He can never be objective. He can never surrender his prejudices and biases. So he refuses to believe that anybody else can. Most nuanced, educated, intelligent people recognize that they can go into one conversation and fight a corner, and then on another day in another room they can go into a conversation and retain absolute objectivity. But if you can't ever imagine changing your mind about anything, I suspect Martin McGuinness will always be either a murderer or a freedom fighter. He'll never be a sort of curious combination of peace broker and death dealer. And that's actually the definition of intellectual. Being able to see both of those, as opposed, well, let's say broadsheet instead of intellectual, as opposed to tabloid. Tabloid is pick a side, start fighting, never stop until the fight is over. Okay? Broadsheet, if you will, for want of a better word, is, do you know what? This isn't black and white. This isn't actually binary. This isn't a case of United versus City or, Albion versus Rovers. This is a man who did absolutely heinous things that he believed he was justified in doing. The parallel perhaps, and feel free to shoot me down on this one, the parallel perhaps, slightly unfortunate choice of phrase there, would be with someone like Nelson Mandela, who also endorsed violence in order to pursue a political end, and realised later in life that the political end he wanted to see, i.e. the end of apartheid, was more likely to be achieved with the abandonment of violence. Why does this confuse people? What's so hard to grasp about the idea that you can do terrible things in your life and then change and recognise that the way to achieve what you want is to abandon terrible things? That seems to me to be actually the distillation of Christian doctrine, believe it or not. 0345 6060973. If he'd killed my family, could I forgive him? No, of course not. I don't think so. You never know until you face it. Joe Berry this morning was inspirational in her Christian charity, but I don't know whether I could rise to that level. But would I want to carry on hating a man who actually did more to bring about peace in these islands than almost any other that's lived? Well, why would I want to carry on hating him? He ended the process that hurt my family. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. What do you think? Should we do that then? Should we have a look at... it was weird growing up with an Irish surname and a dad on the Telegraph, because Telegraph was sort of furiously unionist, always has been, and it probably will continue to be so. So we got some pretty nasty mail. Dad used to frame it and put it up in the downstairs loo. Some pretty nasty, really anti-Irish stuff. There was a journalist on the paper called Barry O'Brien. My dad had the same Christian name as me, and there was one other famous Irish name that eludes me for the moment. And there was one front page, and I think this got sent to Dad with a bullet in the envelope, or that was another one. There was one front page, and they'd circled all the Irish names, and it said, murderous scum, these people shouldn't be on the Telegraph, all of that kind of idea. And that was because of the terrorism. So the IRA made it very difficult in the 1970s or the 1980s to have an Irish surname in some quarters of Britain. There's a story in my friend John McEntie's book that I've shared with you a couple of times now, but it merits repetition. When he was a relatively young man on Fleet Street, while the Troubles were in full flow, I forget which terror atrocity it was, but there was an older Irish lady who'd spent 30 years cleaning the telephones in newspaper offices. So she would get up at the crack of dawn and her job was to disinfect the telephones in newspaper offices. It's not a job that gets done anymore because we've all got mobiles. But if you think about the sort of beery blowhards that populated newspaper offices in those days, it was quite an important job. And there was one bomb that went off, and she came into work the next morning, and John found her crying in the corner and said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "It's never happened like this before. It's people I've known for 20 years, people I've seen every morning of my life for the last 20 years, just looked through me today. They turned away from me. They turned their backs on me." Because that's the thing about terrorists, as a lot of Muslim people have learned in recent years. You can't. Some people won't let you disassociate yourself from the atrocities that are committed in your name. As a young man with an apostrophe in my surname at school in the 1980s, there are a couple of lads that chose that as evidence that I was some sort of terrorist apologist. So you look back on what the IRA did, and it resonated way beyond the province of Northern Ireland. It resonated way beyond the actual locus of the Troubles, and it infected British society for a couple of generations. And yet, if he wanted to achieve peace, he realised he was going to have to stop blowing people up. 0345 6060 973. Not really got a question. I might do the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter, but it seems a little trite in the context of the epic life that we're examining. Epic not necessarily in a good way, but epic in terms of the scale of its impact upon Britain. It just seems to me to be possible that you can change. When the facts change, I change my mind. That Keynes quote pops up on almost every programme we do together at the moment. Do you believe that? Do you believe people can change? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. You can email james@lbc.co.uk. You can text me on 84850. I've got a bit of a different show for you today. I'm inviting into the studio the journalist who's undertaken an astonishing investigation into the pregnancy drug Primados that effectively, at risk of sounding glib and tabloidy, it effectively merits comparisons with thalidomide. You may have seen some of this coverage in the newspapers. Yes, on Sunday. There's going to be a lot more after a documentary goes out on Sky tonight, and the journalist responsible for this is going to join us for about 11:45 to talk us through his discoveries, his research, his investigations. And later, I'm going to introduce you to a man who is the subject of this story on the BuzzFeed website. That I think I'll just give you the headline, and then you can imagine what he's been through, and then you can find out at about 12:30. This is what it's like to be wrongly accused of being a paedophile because of a typo by police. This is in Britain right now. This isn't some story from the other side of the world or from the deep corners of history. All of that to come on the programme, and we'll probably have a look at Jeremy Corbyn as well. It's 10:15. This is Chief Constable George Hamilton, the head of the police service in Northern Ireland this morning, responding to the death of the former IRA commander and former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. That's some journey. Last night. Martin's journey in life challenges all of us who care about the future to be prepared to change, to demonstrate leadership, and to work to understand the world, not just from our perspective, but from the perspectives of everyone in our community. Can you find that journey inspiring, or will you be forever furious about the violence he undertook and endorsed to pursue political ends that were ultimately achieved peacefully? John's in Tallywayne. John, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. Yes, I was interested to hear your intro to the show this morning, and it was very fair and balanced, I must say.
No, don't say that. I'll be fired by the 10:30 news if I end up being all fair and balanced, John.
Oh, I know. That's a terrible thing these days, isn't it? But there you go. It's a cross to bear. I was a member of the security services, security forces, during the time of Martin McGuinness. I served quite a lot of time in South Armagh and County Tyrone. I'm quite knowledgeable about the intricacies of what went on politically and militarily within the IRA during his stint as basically the chief of staff. And what you have to do, and I'm sorry, it's very difficult to try and get into a 2-minute soundbite, but I'll try my best.
Right, you can take as long as you want. It's
Yeah, well, you did say in your intro that facts were the thing that changed people's minds about people. So, here's some facts for what they're worth. In 1978, there was a horrendous terrorist bombing called the Le Mans bombing. I don't know if you remember that.
I don't remember it. I was 6, but I've subsequently become aware of it.
Yeah. Well, I can't remember the exact casualties. It's either 9 or 19 people were burned to death horrendously. They were burned to a crisp in the most awful way possible. They were, that good target for terrorists, the local dog breeders club. It just doesn't bear thinking about, does it? Now, the reason I mention this was in 78, post that particular incident, Jerry Adams was the chief of staff. He was lifted in the terminology of the time and taken into custody, which left, post the Le Mans bombing incident, no chief of staff for the IRA. Martin McGuinness, as the head of the IRA in Londonderry, was put into the position of chief of staff in 78. By 81, by the time of the hunger strike, he realised that the IRA had been completely compromised by informers within its ranks to the security services. There was very little they could do. By the mid-80s, they'd sort of turned it around. Martin McGuinness had actually turned things around. That's why you had things like the Brighton bomb happen, was because he made it a much smaller cellular structure where people didn't know.
So why? I said I wouldn't, but I am going to move you along a little bit. Why then, in your view, did he decide to pursue peaceful process?
Right, yeah. Because the IRA by sort of the mid-80s was getting nowhere through its military strategy of killing soldiers, policemen, and innocent members of the public. Because they'd been totally compromised by the intelligence services. This is why you had things like the Gibraltar killings and the Loch Gore killings, is because the security services knew every move they were making. He was basically stuck. He had to move into the political arena to try and get his agenda moving. Now, he didn't, he would have quite happily, I'm sure, and this is where a little bit of conjecture comes in, he would have been quite happy to carry on using the Armalite and the bomb.
That's not a little bit of conjecture, is it? That's a huge rewriting of received wisdom.
Well, it's not really, James, unfortunately.
Okay, why do you think Dr. Ian Paisley broke bread with him so enthusiastically?
Because he was a politician, and they'll break bread with anybody.
Well, not really. Not Ian Paisley. He was still describing the Pope as the Antichrist as he went to meet his own maker. So the idea. No, it's not. It's Ian Paisley and various other key unionists with peace as the priority were prepared and believed that Martin McGuinness was acting in good faith. You don't.
No, I don't. And because he was quite happy to carry on the bomb as opposed to the ballot. The only reason he didn't, and I can't go into the intricacies of this because I'd be breaking the Official Secrets Act.
That's convenient.
That sounds a bit glib. Well, I just said, I know it sounds a bit glib, but, I've got to think of myself, haven't I?
So why couldn't he join the real IRA then?
Pardon?
Why couldn't he join the real IRA?
Martin, well, because it's pointless, isn't it?
Well, no, they continued killing and maiming and blowing up innocent people long after Martin McGuinness laid down his arms. If he wanted to carry on doing that, he could have done. Why didn't he?
Well, he didn't do it because they were basically an offshoot, like the Irish National Liberation Army was. Don't forget Martin McGuinness.
I know exactly what they were. That's why I'm asking. If he was keen to carry on killing people and didn't because the IRA had been compromised, why didn't he go and join the real IRA?
Because of the Because, James, the reason why he didn't do that was because, as I mentioned earlier, the IRA had been completely compromised.
No, that's what I just said. If the IRA had been completely compromised and he actually wanted to carry on killing people, why didn't he go and join the splinter group in the real IRA or join some of the other dissident groups that carried on killing people after he devoted himself to the peace process?
Well, he devoted himself to the peace process because he realised there was no point in killing people anymore.
Oh.
That's the point I'm making, and I think we've got a wire slightly crossed here, is that he would have carried on the bomb as opposed to the ballot if he realised it would gain Irish independence. That's what I'm saying. There's no point joining a split.
With respect then, you're right, we have got our wires crossed. You've spent 12 minutes telling me what everybody already knows.
No, I haven't. No,
he laid down his arms because he realised it wasn't working, and he then became dedicated to peace.
He became dedicated to peace because he didn't have any other alternative.
Well, we just said he did have another alternative. He could have joined the real IRA. I'm grateful for your input, John, but again, either you're telling me something that everybody already knows, or you're trying to somehow suggest that he wanted to carry on killing people and somehow sat on his hands and didn't because because not killing people would be more effective, which is just a different way of saying exactly the same thing.
You know, you've got to understand what it is like to be in a situation which is basically a terrorist war, okay? He knew that he could not move forward using weapons and bombs, okay?
Well, just like Nelson Mandela did.
Well, Nelson Mandela didn't kill innocent people to the extent of Martin McGuinness did. Let's get that
He
fact.
served 27 years in prison. God knows what he would have done if he hadn't.
I don't think Nelson Mandela should be brought into this. He's clearly a reasonable person. Look,
so Martin McGuinness wasn't a reasonable person.
Not by any stretch of the imagination.
Right, now we're getting to the gist of it. And unfortunately, we're about to run out of time. So he doesn't deserve any credit at all for the peace process that both sides considered, including people like Ian Paisley, considered him to have been absolutely intrinsic to.
No, and I'll tell you for why. Start looking to the families of the people who were killed on his orders, who were buried in various bogs and fields around Northern Ireland.
We began the whole programme by looking at them.
Oh, and what did they say?
Pardon?
What did the families say?
So I said if he'd killed my family members, I would not be able to forgive him. I couldn't be as big as Jo Berry, who lost her dad in the Brighton hotel bomb. But the bigger picture of peace is the one to which Martin McGuinness subsequently dedicated himself. And while you're perfectly entitled to believe that he did it for what reasons was it again? The fact that killing wasn't working, so he embraced peace, but deep down he'd like to have carried on killing. Is that where we are? Is that a fair summation?
No, it's not. The reason he went to where he was in the mid-'80s, or towards the end of the 80s, was because he realised that he'd been so compromised, the IRA had been so compromised.
Yeah, and then we're back to why didn't he just join the real IRA and try and set up a terrorist organisation that could have rediscovered the uncompromised nature that it enjoyed during the periods you began by describing. Cheers, John. It's 10:29, and as I said, in our furiously binary zeitgeist, it's impossible for people to recognise that he could be good and bad, this man. He could be bad and then good, in the same way that some people can be good and then bad. Ian Paisley, a man who genuinely believed that Republicans were destined to burn in the fires of eternal damnation, came to like Martin McGuinness. Weirdly, those two men are an example to us all. Well, almost all. It's 10:30. Martin McGuinness was both. I get enough emphasis on that word. This is what makes his story so fascinating and so problematic. He was both a murderous terrorist and a powerful force for peace. He changed. Our furiously binary zeitgeist can't really process it, can't compute such change, partly because it's so close. I'm going to speak in a moment to Mark, who was present for the Bishopsgate bomb, and has just sent me a picture of the aftermath of that bomb. You expect him to be able to see Martin McGuinness as anything other than murderous terrorist? Of course he can't. But then you listen to someone like the late Dr. Ian Paisley, a furious opponent of all Republicans, and I get comfortable saying this, a hater of Catholics. And he saw Martin McGuinness by the end of his life as a friend and as a co-architect of the peace process. So the truth is often a lot more complicated than we like to admit. Pick a side and then defend it furiously. Martin McGuinness drives a coach and horses through that. That's why people who would never, 30 years ago, have given him the time of day, today are queuing up to pay tribute to his role in that peace process. 10:35 is the time. Steve is in Putney. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
A bit of a devil's advocate I'm playing at the moment. I suppose I can understand between the hardliners of the IRA currently that are still there, still self-evident, like you said, the real IRA. Plus, on the politics side with the UK, he had a hard path to tread. I might digress slightly. I was in the Household Cavalry in 1982 when my colleagues were blown up by the IRA in the car bombing. 6 horses, Irish drafts. Ironically, 4 of my colleagues blown, Blues and Royals. Recently, the Northern Irish Police have investigated ex-lifeguard from the 70s who's having to go to court, wanted to go on holiday with his wife. He's in his 70s. They've stopped him from doing that because he has to attend court. This beggar's belief is the fact that the individual that blew the horses up and the 4 colleagues of mine in 1982 went to the High Court this year, proved DNA that it was him. Because of our government, and I say again, our government, and the Good Friday Agreement, he had a letter from impunity from being prosecuted, and he walked away from court. Now, where is the balance in that?
There isn't any.
The balance
it's grossly unfair.
With the Good Friday Agreement, that Martin McGuinness, as you said earlier on, was heavily involved with obviously British politics as well and politicians.
Yes.
Where is the outcome on that? Why should everybody feel, how are we supposed to feel? Where is the fairness in it?
There isn't any.
So where's there no consideration, understanding and implementation for this individual that's about to go to court in his
I think
for doing his job?
But no one's arguing with you. It's wrong. If you're going to offer, if a conflict ends and one side somehow gets immunity from retrospective prosecution, it's absurd that the other side doesn't. I presume you know what the argument is. The argument is that the army to which you belonged has to be seen to observe. It's got echoes of Marine A, actually, this. It has to be seen to observe higher standards and closer adherence to the rules and regulations than what is an illegal terrorist organisation. And I could, if I was an academic, make that case. I could, if I was a politician, make that case. Steve, the reason why your former comrade is being dragged over the coals like this is because the British Army has to be seen to be superior to the IRA terrorists. It has to be seen to abide by rules and regulations and honour in a way that terrorists, by dint of being criminals, don't. And that is quite a powerful argument, but I wouldn't make it to you. I wouldn't insult you by trying to. I think it's disgusting that they're pursuing soldiers and letting their former enemies, whether you want to call them terrorists or, as the Republicans would call them, soldiers, whatever you want to call them, you can't let them not be held accountable for things that happened 30 years ago. Well, try to hold soldiers accountable for things that did.
Absolutely, and I hope if there's any, as you rightly put, but if there's any politicians listening to your show, and I'm sure there is, I hope he does get the same understanding.
So do I.
Consideration and implementation, exactly the same as that individual walked away from court, a British court. It would be quite comical if it wasn't so damn serious.
I get it, and I mean, I think this possibly is why you warned us that you might be digressing slightly, because I don't know if you're expecting me to argue with you, but I'm not going to.
No, not at all. On the contrary, no, I hadn't come on for an argument. I made it quite clear at the start. I mean,
just to highlight this injustice. I mean, you recognise what I said, though. I mean, that you know what the argument is. That's why I said, somewhat surprisingly, I could see some echoes of Marine A, because when people say, well, look, what would the Taliban have done to him? That somehow was used to justify, when he was still convicted of murder as opposed to manslaughter, to justify what he did to the Taliban fighter. And you, as a British soldier, are supposed to be better than the terrorists. You're supposed to be better than the jihadists, the murderers, whatever it may be. But if you're going to rewrite history, if you're going to shake the Etch-a-Sketch for one side and clear everything, you've got to clear it for the other. So what are your thoughts about Martin McGuinness specifically, then, Steve? We'll agree that what's happening to your former colleague is wrong.
He was a hardened terrorist, and as the previous individual that was on the phone, ex-member of the forces, said, he had I'm saying personally, he had a hard line to follow. I understand that. But he had the transition from total outright terrorist to politician, shaking the Queen's hand, which, to be quite honest with you, stung a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of ex-swaddies and ex-members of the forces took a deep breath when they saw that. However, he came a long way, a bit like Mandela. Mandela could have turned South Africa on its head, but he didn't. So he had a hard path to tread. However, having said that, you said, well, he could have joined the IRA. The individual brought up the fact that he understood that the bomb and the bullet wasn't working.
Yes.
Whether he would have gone back to that, I don't know. But he didn't join the IRA or the real IRA, as you suggested, because he knew the bullet and the bomb wasn't going anywhere.
Which oddly means that his goal was peace, not disruption. Some terrorists seem to love the fight more than they love the cause. Do you know what I mean? And that perhaps is what elevated him above some of his former comrades.
But by the same token, I was reading this morning on the news that by 21, I think he was one of the commanders in Belfast. You know, that's on a
Derry, I think.
Scale, in Derry at 21, that's quite a high position to order men around to whatever they're going to do.
Yes, but again, perhaps the qualities that he displayed there, for want of a better word, were the same attributes, there you go, better than qualities, there's no value judgment, that saw him rise to the top of Sinn Féin. Can I run something by you, just sort of as chatting? Does it feel a bit, sometimes when a court case, a particularly grisly court case is unfolding and a verdict comes in, and some of us feel that the victim's family should have more say in what the sentence is. And of course, the law doesn't allow that to happen, precisely because it has to be objective. Justice has to be blind. If the family of a murder victim were responsible for the sentencing of the murderer, then, we'd be effectively going back to ancient Rome and we'd be having public executions. Do you think this is a bit like that? Do you think ICANN, albeit with a tiny little investment in Irish history, because by dint of my family background, but I haven't been touched by terrorism. I haven't been involved in the military, so I can somehow step above it and see him as both good and bad. The deeper you are in it, the harder it is to do that. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course it is, because you're emotionally involved.
Yes.
Getting back to Martin McGuinness, a 21-year-old head, as we all were totally different to a mature head.
Oh, that's very true.
In time, he matured, could see he wasn't getting anywhere. He's changed individually. And, of course, the peace process kicked in, and he was instrumental in that.
Yes. Why do you think people find it so hard to believe that other people can change? Given that none of us would describe ourselves as the same at 45 to what we were at 21.
Yeah, but they say a leopard never changes its spots, do they? So I don't know. Should we rest it on that?
Yeah, let's leave it there, Steve. Thank you, mate. Take care. 10:43 is the time. Mark is in Chelsea. Mark, I know you've got a personal story to tell me, so if I interrupt it with the travel news, I promise you I'll come back afterwards. What did you want to say?
That's fine. Hi, James. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You're welcome.
It was. I was present at the Bishopsgate bomb in April 1993.
Yes.
I was taken to hospital with minor injuries and nothing major. But your question this morning sort of obviously brought that back to me a little bit.
Yes.
I'm not blaming you for that. But it wasn't. It was just, to think that, your initial question, can somebody change? And I think Martin McGuinness definitely did. He was like your previous caller, fascinating call, saying that he was a young man, perhaps an angry young man, doing very...
Terrorists are always young, aren't they, actually? When you look at Islamist terrorism now, it won't hold true right across the board, but it does seem to be that impetuousness of youth that feeds into the narrative of terrorism. Yeah,
and then obviously, being so great with the instrumentalism of the peace process, he has done, questionably good things as well. But I think, my call really is to say that a lot of people have forgotten what he has actually done.
Yes.
You've been very honest, James. That he was a murderer.
Yes.
The guy was a murderer. He's a terrorist. He condoned violence. He killed innocent people, men, women, children. And, he served a very small time in prison for that. 6 months, I believe.
Not for the crimes you've just described. There's no evidence that he committed them directly, but he certainly would have ordered them as a commander in the IRA, and therefore condoned them. And just to, if I may, the suggestion is, of course, that because justice wasn't seen to be done for these atrocities, including the one that you were caught up in, there's a real difficulty in the kind of immunity that was afforded to him and to other former members of the IRA. And yet, at the same time, there would be no peace process if Martin McGuinness was still being held accountable for crimes that he'd committed in his youth. There would have been no peace process. You couldn't have delivered the IRA to the negotiations unless they were led into those negotiations by a senior member of the IRA, and he couldn't be a senior member of the IRA unless he'd been complicit, implicit, and explicitly involved in terrorist atrocities. This is why binary thinking is so attractive, isn't it? The more you think about this, the harder it is to have a strong opinion.
It is, but I think... a guy like Martin McGuinness, and I think, justice was not done. We think about, we're thinking about the people that have been, injured, killed, their lives turned upside down by the likes of Martin McGuinness and him, of course. He should have served time. He should have suffered. He should have gone to prison, and he should still be there. He should have died in prison.
And then there'd be no peace process, and there'd be many, many more dead in Northern Ireland and probably on the mainland as well.
Yes, you're right. You are right, James. Yeah.
And they're in a nutshell between us. We've cut to the heart of this whole conversation, haven't we?
Yeah. From what you've said, I can't argue with you at all.
I can't argue with you either. And if I'd been caught up, I was at college that day. I remember when the bomb went off. I was at Aldwych at the London School of Economics, and it was chilling. It was terrifying. It was familiar for people who'd been in London during the heights of the Troubles, but I remember it. And if I'd been where you were and I'd been taken to hospital, I'd find it almost impossible to sort of contemplate a nuanced reaction. I'd want him to rot in jail for the rest of his life, and everybody responsible. But that's why you don't make the decision, isn't it? That's why you're not negotiating the peace process. It's why you're not in charge. It's why the families of murder victims don't get to decide what the sentence is for a murderer. It's the greater good. That's the horrible phrase lurking behind our conversation. The greater good was served by not punishing him for the crimes that he did.
But it's still wrong.
It's the greater good.
But if you tell that to somebody who's lost their child, lost their little girl, then that's a different conversation.
It's a different conversation in tone, but not in fact. In fact, the conversation is it's wrong that the man responsible for your little girl's death did not rot in jail, but by dint of not rotting in jail and leading the peace process, many, many more little girls didn't have their lives ended or compromised. And that's horrible. Absolutely horrible. But that's life, as opposed to a kind of, tribal or football team style adherence to one side. Whatever. Muhammad Ali, and I quote this proudly, I don't think this is trite or glib or anything. Muhammad Ali, I think, who said that the man who views the world at 50 the same as he did at 20 has wasted 30 years of his life. But again, if I'd been caught up like Mark was, I don't know if I'd be able to achieve the distance to say, yeah, he was good and bad. He was bad and good. 10:48. You can't, I don't think... I don't think you'd be able to. I don't think I'd be able to see beyond my own suffering if I'd suffered personal loss during the Troubles. It's a point that Incorrigible FCA makes. He also makes a brilliant point that this narrative that Martin McGuinness only joined the peace process because the IRA were a busted flush. They'd been so fatally compromised by the security services that they were no longer a force. Well, that rather begs the question, why the hell did the British government offer them a peace process then? If they were literally, one step away from annihilation, the British government would have doubled down and annihilated them. It's a relatively ludicrous argument, not least because terrorist organisations are Hydra-like by dint of being beneath the surface, by dint of being illegal and covert. They disappear and reappear in other areas. Just look at modern terrorism for evidence of that. So I think, once again, John Major's role in this will probably get overlooked. Increasingly emerging as a politician and statesman of very, very rare integrity, John Major. I know he cheated on his wife, but still, what an absolute titan. But he didn't look right, and unfortunately in this country, he didn't go to the right kind of school. Son of a bus conductor, very, very different from daughter of a vicar, if you want to keep a certain type of British journalist happy. Son of a bus conductor? No. Daughter of a vicar, there you go, that's proper humble. John Major, I think, bears as much responsibility for the peace process as anybody who actually grew up in Northern Ireland, on either side of the fence. So, Martin McGuinness, good and bad, right? Gary's in Bristol. Gary, what would you like to say?
Yeah, how you doing, James? I actually grew up during the Troubles, and my dad was a prison officer in the Maze prison, so I have a first-hand experience.
So for people who don't know, the Maze was specifically for IRA prisoners.
Yeah, and I remember I was about 8 or 9 at the time, going into a hotel in Newcastle, County Down, and 2 IRA members were actually sitting in the lounge. Within less than a couple of minutes of my dad being at the bar, we had to be literally 180 straight out the door, straight in the car. So for me and my wee brother at that stage, we didn't really understand what was going on.
God.
But without Martin McGuinness, there wouldn't be a peace process. So as much as it pains me to look back at some of the horrific things that he did, not only was my dad threatened several times, bombs were put under some of his best friends' cars. Some were lucky, some were not. But, without him and Ian Paisley and multiple other people that were also involved, which a lot of people forget, without these guys sitting at the table, if you go right back to the start, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness or Sinn Féin and the DUP wouldn't even sit in the same room.
No.
They basically had to use intermediaries. So a lot of people aren't aware of that. So from somebody that comes, as they say, back home from the other side of the fence, I think without those guys, there wouldn't be a modern day peace process. And,
that's what I meant by the greater good. It's very hard. And if your dad had been targeted successfully by them, you probably wouldn't be able to speak as clearly as you do now. The closer you are to personal suffering, the harder it would be to step back.
Yeah,
but the greater good is served by the peace process, regardless of how how much it sticks in the craw when you think back on the crimes that went unpunished.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, one of my very, very, very good friends back home is actually Jean McConville's granddaughter. You know, we're best friends. One's a Protestant, I'm a Protestant, and one of my best friends is a Catholic. I've got many friends now who are actually in mixed marriages. 30 years ago, that wouldn't have been allowed. I mean, I myself got engaged a week ago to a Catholic girl. 30 years ago, I couldn't have done that. We'd have had to have left the province. I luckily now live in England, so it's not an issue, and I wouldn't have cared anyway.
That's amazing. I think people forget that, and the notion that even 30 years ago, your love would have been a kind of a taboo. It would have been across the barricades, and it wouldn't have been tolerated by either family, or perhaps even if your families came on side, the rest of the community, the rest of the street on which you lived would have struggled with it.
Yeah, and we would actually have to move out of certain areas because if you would be targeted. Either side that you were from, they would not accept that two people from two different backgrounds couldn't be together, and it was horrific what I grew up with.
That's really.
We also,
go on.
Had segregated schools as well. So my mum told me, whenever I was growing up, my best friend who lived next door, actually 2 brothers and a sister, were Catholics, and my mum told me that we couldn't understand when one had to go to one school, one had to go there. I asked my mum, why is Pete going to a different school to me, Mum? Why is that? And how do you explain that to a 4-year-old or 5-year-old going to his first day at school? We didn't comprehend 2 different schools, which were like 60 feet apart. It's
listening to you, I'm reminded of how similar this is to, it's ancient. It's as old as the hills in many ways. The idea that it's so hard to recognise how similar people are, even when they're in the midst of war, in the midst of fighting and fury. That's the message in the 21st century, is where a lot of recent political developments are built on people who are absolutely insistent and convinced that we're fundamentally different. We're fundamentally different. Recognise the similarity and peace follows.
Yeah, and and this, as they call it, the modern troubles. The troubles go back over 300 years. So
of course, so, yeah. And Kieran's been in touch with me actually from the other side of the fence, from where you reside, pointing out we've lacked a little bit of context on the reasons why the Republican movement grew up. I may spend a little longer on this actually. I've got some astonishing calls waiting to contribute. And just for those who don't know, Jean McConville, to whom Gary referred, was murdered by the IRA, who mistakenly believed that she'd passed on information to the security services. It's never been solved, that murder. Quite a lot in the air today, news-wise, so I'm just going to crack on with as much of it as I can. I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm learning a lot in this conversation about Martin McGuinness. I'm learning a lot about history, but also about the difficulty, the completely understandable difficulty that societies have when they've been torn apart by sectarianism and division, in recognising that people on the opposite side could have in any way had redeeming features. There's a few kind of points that need to be made as well. I'm just wondering if your caller's saying, this is sent from Derry, where Martin McGuinness hailed from. I'm just wondering if your caller's saying that Martin McGuinness should have rotted in jail, also think that the soldiers who murdered innocent people on Bloody Sunday should suffer the same fate. I wonder also, do they know the inequalities that the nationalist and Republican people of Derry suffered in the 20th century? The people of Derry and the rest of the UK are in a better place today as a result of Martin McGuinness's partnership with Ian Paisley and him leading republicanism to democracy. And Kieran, from a similar place, writes, James, can we get a bit of balance and context here, please? McGuinness and the IRA had legitimate grievances with the society in which they grew up. Police violence, explicit discrimination against Catholics, and in 1972, the state-sponsored murder of peaceful British citizens protesting for nothing more than the chance to receive fair treatment in allocation of housing, jobs, and other basic rights. I am no fan of the IRA or state-sponsored violence, but there really is a huge amount of context required whenever this topic is discussed. So, I mean, those are thoughtful, measured, evidence-based contributions to the programme. Other people listening to the same hour are convinced that I've been embarked upon some sort of project to canonise Martin McGuinness. So it goes to show what I said at the very outset. A life like his is utterly, utterly at odds with the furious binary zeitgeist that we're immersed in at the moment. Those two texters capable of clear vision. A lot of people not. And if you had a personal investment in that, if you suffered a personal loss, I've got absolutely no criticism of you for being able to step above that and see the bigger picture. I don't think I'd be able to. But for the rest of us, it's a choice you make. You either see that there are two sides to any argument, or you choose not to. You choose to pretend there's only one side, and then you stick your fingers in your ears and start whistling Dixie. Speaking of which, a few of you are wondering whether I'm going to be tackling this letter from Conservative MPs accusing the BBC of being biased on Brexit. There's nothing to say about that. If these Conservative MPs are worried that the confusion and regret being reported in all of the media needs to be somehow addressed or balanced out with clarity and confidence, it's straightforward. You get Liam Fox, David Davis and Boris Johnson to accept all the invitations, including a permanent one to come onto this programme, but this isn't the BBC, it's the BBC that we're talking about. Go on to all of the BBC news programmes as often as you possibly can and explain to people the clarity and the confidence that you currently believe is lacking. Don't send letters. These Tory MPs, don't send letters complaining about reports that reflect regret and confusion. Send out the key Brexiters, send out the key ministers, send out the secretaries of state who can challenge this confusion and regret, who can provide clarity and confidence, who can say, don't worry about that because we've got this and this in place. If there's a feeling abroad that the narrative is beginning to reflect confusion and regret rather more than a lot of these people like, the answer is not to tell the people reporting it to be quiet. That's a terrifying path to go down. The answer is to come forward with the opposing arguments. So my phone lines are open, Boris. 0345 606 0973. You want to give me a quick ring and tell me, for example, why we shouldn't be worried today about reports that the cost of cars are about to go up by £2,300 potentially. That's the price of an average car under a hard Brexit, according to research. Elsewhere in the news today, you can see that the price of beer is about to go up. Some brands, some brews may even disappear from our pubs. The estimated cost to each car maker of exporting British-built cars to the EU, potentially, is about 460 million quid. That would render plants unaffordable and force most companies to consider relocating factories to the European mainland. So my phone lines are open for Liam Fox to ring in and explain why that's not a problem. Otherwise, when you report stuff like that, and it looks like bad news, and they can't provide any clarity or confidence as to why you shouldn't be worried about this, then they've got two choices. Either they kind of shut up, or they insist that everybody else does. Here's the story, all right? Let's pick this one. 2,300 quid to be added to the price of an average car under a hard Brexit. This is going to see car prices go up by about 10% because of the imposition of tariffs. Tariffs that David Davis in the Brexit Select Committee last week said in response to Hilary Benn's question, yeah, that is what would happen if we had to trade under World Trade Organization rules. So he's agreed with this. Should we wait for the call? It's going to provide clarity and confidence. Because otherwise, you're being conned again. They're going to start calling for the reporting to be changed. They're going to be... I think this letter actually said, the BBC should fear for its future. Look, here's a story. It looks bad. Give me a ring and tell me why it's good. If you're involved in the Brexit process. Put forward your ministers. Put them into studios. Send them out. Go forth and multiply. Provide clarity and confidence. Because if you can't provide clarity and confidence, then the reports that reflect regret and confusion aren't just important. They're irrefutable. That's quite scary. I told you this was going to happen, but I thought it would take another 2 weeks. I said to you that when Article 50 is triggered, you'll see a massive ramping up of the calls for coverage to stop. The tiny little corners of the commercial British media where I mostly operate, the tiny little corners of it where you can still get an objective overview, where you can still get balance. They'll be next. Shut up. Silence. Ramonas. BBC reports stuff that's quite unpalatable. The answer to that is either to balance it out, to provide the clarity and confusion, or to call for them to shut up. You're welcome to judge which you think is happening at the moment. 10 minutes after 11 is the time. Jeremy Corbyn on the menu this hour. Can we conduct that conversation in a way that will leave any of us feeling better at the end of it than we do at the beginning? I don't know. A little bit more on Martin McGuinness, and there's a few other things we need to address as well. I'm going to introduce you to the journalist who's undertaken an astonishing investigation into a pregnancy drug that has, borne some comparisons to, it's nowhere near on the same scale, but the obvious parallel would be with thalidomide. Thousands of women in the UK used the drug in the 1960s and 70s. Research at the time suggested it could be linked to a higher risk of women giving birth to babies born with abnormalities, and the latest research by the journalist Jason Farrell that will go out on Sky tonight is, well, it's astonishing. And I'm also going to introduce you to a man who was wrongly accused of being a paedophile, had his entire life turned upside down as a direct result of a typographic error, a typo, a mistake on some paperwork made by police. Before all of that, though, back to Martin McGuinness and over to Germany, actually, where Brent has called from, Hanover. Brent, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hey, Brent.
Great on your brilliant show.
Thank you.
I did 4 tours in Northern Ireland, and I've had friends of mine actually murdered by the IRA. And this thing about Martin McGuinness, in reality, it's been a good thing, because I can remember in Germany even being attacks happened in Germany, where every morning we had to go out and check our cars for bombs before we actually went to work.
God.
And I just can't imagine the fear of those living in Northern Ireland facing it on a daily basis. Now, if we'd not have done this deal at all, there would have been more and more people dead. Maybe many hundreds have died since then. Those people are now alive and living a life because of the peace deal. So although it does leave a bad taste in my mouth and in many people's mouths, I think we have to understand the benefits of the peace deal.
How can you do that as an ex-soldier? Did you presumably you'd have seen things that no one should see? I don't know if you lost comrades, but what do you think gives you the ability to step above the personal and see instead the political, as it were, the big picture?
Because what I see is, although, like I said, I've had comrades of mine actually murdered in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
I've actually been close to a bomb explosion, and I've seen the fear in people's eyes. Well, the reason I say this is simple. There's people now alive who would probably be dead now, who are getting on with life, and things are getting slowly back to normal. It's going to take some time. But
well, you heard the last caller before the news getting engaged to a girl who 30 years ago would have been... it would have been taboo. Schools, barriers breaking down, and the peace process has been no things are 100% good or 100% bad, but the peace process has been a hell of a lot better than anything that went before.
That's exactly my position. You know, if we wouldn't have done that, there would have been more people killed. It would have been going on and going on. Now people can go about lives in a fairly safe way, and that's the benefit of the peace deal. So, although, like I say, I'm sure most of us would love to have seen McGuinness and Jerry Adams dead. The fact is, we've now got a bit of peace, and people in Northern Ireland can live a decent life. It's not a case of forgiving them or making them gods or whatever. It's just fact these people now can live a life, a decent life like we.
I think you've closed this conversation down, Brent. I don't think there's anything to say after this. You say you can completely understand why some people might have wanted to see them dead, but if you can just park the emotion, park the subjectivity, park the personal, and look at the objective, look at the universal, look at the big human picture, it's the greater good that was served by him being part of the peace process, and he couldn't have been part of the peace process if he was being pursued for crimes he committed in his youth.
You know, and the thing is, James, if you look at reality, Jerry Adams and McGuinness have been at this a long, long time. When I can go back to 1972 when I was, 1973 when I was in Ireland, it was going on then. So really, we was never going to catch them anyway. They're too slippery. They keep their fingers clean. So we'd never actually have caught them. So there'd been no benefit not to do the deal. It would have just carried on. And they still would be walking around now with the big houses, the money, the big cars, and all the support they had.
Yeah, and the criminality that, of course, brought a lot of unhappiness to people who were ostensibly on the same side of the political divide, the organised crime and in the latter years of the IRA, the drug dealing and all that sort of thing that blighted entire communities. Just to clarify, for anyone who's just tuned in, 4 tours you did in Northern Ireland, Brent?
Yeah.
Well, that means that I feel pathetic. All of my thoughts are kind of irrelevant next to yours, aren't they? I'm delighted that they chime, but I think your comments are worth about 1 million times more than mine this morning.
No, because your comments really are in line with my comments about what we've benefited from the peace process. And it doesn't matter if you've been there and if you've seen what's gone on and suffered the consequences. It's just human nature to say, well, let's have peace. I mean, that's got to be the answer to all, is it not?
I think so, Brent. You think so. All people who want peace think so, but an awful lot of people don't want peace. And that is, I suppose, one of the great mysteries of humanity. Brent, thank you so much.